He was just a scientist who dared to tell the truth before the world pressed the button. The command will call him a traitor. His colleagues will call him crazy. But what happened after his report made America speak up for the first time in decades. You want to know when it started? Not the war. No, I mean my war, the quiet one. The kind where you don't carry a gun, but every word you say might blow your life apart. It started with a report. Just paper, just numbers, just facts. The kind they pretend to like when it fits the mission, but if it makes them uncomfortable, suddenly you're unpatriotic. Suddenly you are a disruption. Let me take you back. It was June of 1945. I was 33. Sharp suit, tired eyes, black skin. Not that they ever let me forget that part. I was working at Los Alamos, tucked deep in the desert like we were hiding from God. And maybe we were. That morning, the sun hit the sand like a damn spotlight, hot enough to cook a man's pride straight off his bones. The labs buzzed, not with life, but with pressure. Folks moving like ghosts, whispering about Trinity, Japan, deadlines for death. I'd just finished a 14-hour run of simulations. My hands were still shaking. Not from caffeine, from what I saw. The math was loud, it screamed. If we dropped this thing we were building, it wasn't going to be some clean little boom that knocked out a few enemy tanks. No, this would turn a whole city into a wound, a flash. Then silence. And the silence would kill slower than the bomb. Children gasping, old folks burned to the bone, babies born broken for years to come. But see, none of that was in the headlines, and it sure as hell wasn't in the official memos. So I wrote it down myself. A full report. Equations. Projected blast radius. Fallout estimates. Human toll. I stayed up that whole night crafting it, like I was building a case for the soul of the country. I thought, maybe they don't know. Maybe they just need someone to spell it out. Like a fool, I believed that mattered. 2 days later, I took that report straight to the top. General Leslie Groves, big man, bigger ego. The kind of officer who thought his uniform was smarter than any man inside a lab coat. His office smelled like old leather and new lies. He didn't look up. "Dr. Hendley," he grunted, flipping through some budget notes. "You have a minute. Just one." "General," I said, holding the file close like a damn baby. "You need to read this." He finally looked up, cold, calculating. "You people are getting too bold lately." "You people?" "Civilians." "Right." I laid the folder down on his desk carefully. "This isn't a complaint. It's a warning. You drop that device on a civilian city, the consequences don't end when the dust settles. This isn't just about winning a war. This is about what kind of world comes after." He opened the file, skimmed 2 pages, and then snapped it shut like it burned his fingers. "What you're suggesting is insubordination," he said flatly. "What I'm suggesting is humanity." He leaned back in his chair, studying me the way some folks study cockroaches. "You scientists," he muttered, "always crying over theory. This is war. We are fighting an empire that started this madness. We are going to finish it." With children's bones? The room went dead silent. I could hear the tick of the second hand on the wall clock. He didn't shout. Didn't slam a fist. He smiled. That smile right there. That's when I knew I was finished. "Dr. Hendley, you have 2 choices," he said. "Withdraw this report quietly, or I'll have your clearance revoked by sundown." I nodded. "Then you better start the paperwork now." They escorted me out like I was radioactive. No handshakes, no thank yous. Just 2 MPs, stiff as boards. walking me off the compound like I was a thief. The moment I stepped outside those gates, my badge was dead, my name erased from meeting rosters, my notes seized, my housing gone. Even the friends who used to slap me on the back during lunch wouldn't meet my eyes now. You could almost hear them think, better him than me. I called my wife that night from a payphone in Albuquerque. "Lena," I said, "they fired me." Her breath caught, but she didn't ask why. She knew me too well. "They said I stepped out of line. I tried to speak the truth, and they called it treason." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Good. That means you still have a soul." I spent that night in a cheap motel with no radio, no whiskey, and no idea what I'd do next. But I'll tell you this, I slept better than Groves did, because I knew one thing. Whatever they did with that bomb, my hands were clean. For now. What happened next changed everything. You won't want to miss what came after this. Let me tell you something about silence. The kind that settles in after they throw you out the door. Not loud, not angry, just still. The kind that creeps into your coat pocket, sits beside you on the bus, and reminds you every mile, you're not welcome anymore. After Los Alamos, I didn't just lose a job. I lost my name in every room that used to open for me. Doors that used to swing wide. Now they clicked shut like safes. Nobody wanted to be seen talking to the guy who questioned the mission. Not when the mission had a flag on it. And let me be clear, they didn't blacklist me with headlines. They did it smarter than that. Quiet. Systematic. Lab after lab suddenly had no funding, no openings, better fits. My resume went from impressive to invisible in 2 weeks flat. But I wasn't trying to get back in. I was trying to be heard. I stayed in New Mexico for a bit. Not by choice. I couldn't afford to move, and D.C. sure as hell wasn't sending plane tickets. I got a small room near a rail yard, where the nights were filled with the sound of steam, shouting, and regret. I taught night classes at a local trade school, thermodynamics to men who worked 12-hour shifts at the metal plant and still showed up smelling like burnt oil and hope. One of them, Jameson, asked me after class, "Professor, you ever work on that atomic stuff?" I looked him dead in the eye. I did. He nodded like that meant something. Then he said, "Hope you ain't still working on it," and walked out. But I was still working on it. In my head. Every night. The same question spinning. What if I was wrong? What if they're right? What if it really takes a monster to end monsters? Then I'd remember what I saw in those simulations. Radiation patterns, long-term casualties, and that shut the argument down real fast. You can lie to your country, but you can't lie to physics. 3 weeks after they cut me loose, I got a letter. Not from the Army, not from the White House, from a nurse. Handwritten, tidy penmanship. "Dear Dr. Hendley, I read your report. One of the aides passed it around before they took it down. I don't know what they did to you, but I wanted to say, I saw it, and I believe you." Enclosed was a sketch. A child's drawing, not a city skyline, not a mushroom cloud, just a figure standing alone in the middle of fire, holding a paper in their hand. That was me, I suppose. Funny thing, a letter like that should have made me feel better. But it didn't. It made it worse. Because it meant someone had listened, and still nothing changed. Now here's where things got messier. A week later, a man in a government car knocked on my door. Didn't give his name. Wore a suit that fit too well for New Mexico heat. "You're Dr. Hendley?" I was. "We'd like to speak with you." They didn't ask. They told. Took me to a local office. Nothing dramatic. No chains, no shouting. Just 2 men, 2 chairs, 1 long table. One of them leaned in. "You're not in trouble, Dr. Hendley, but we are asking, respectfully, that you refrain from further communication about your previous assignment." I leaned back. "You mean, stop talking about the thing that's about to rewrite human history?" He didn't blink. Just said, "You had your chance to contribute. You chose a different path. That path does not include public commentary." "Let me guess," I said. "National security?" "No, national unity. Now, I've heard a lot of polished nonsense in my time, but that was gold-plated." I laughed, out loud, and when I was done I said, "You're scared someone might believe me." He just smiled. "We're not scared of you, Doctor. We're scared of distraction." That was the word they used. Distraction, not truth, not warning. Distraction. After that, things escalated. My phone line, static. My mailbox, torn letters. One night I came home and found my window cracked open. Nothing stolen. But my notes were rearranged. Not by accident. They weren't threatening me, not exactly. They were reminding me, "We see you. We decide what matters." But they forgot something. They built a bomb. I built the conscience they tried to bury it under. So I did the only thing left. I found a local printer, paid him in cash, ran off 20 copies of a redacted version of my report, left them at union halls, barber shops, train depots. Not to start a riot, just to start a thought. And the funny thing, nobody chased me for it. Because once the machine labels you discredited, you can say anything. You're just background noise now. A faded caution sign. But I wasn't trying to be a sign. I was trying to be a crack in the wall. The next week, I gave a talk at a small university. Titled it, "Science After War, Who Holds the Mirror?" 10 people showed up. 1 fell asleep, but 2 stayed behind after. One asked me, "Would you do it again?" I didn't hesitate. Yes, because silence is how the worst things survive. The other one just nodded, said, "My brother's overseas. I hope the people making decisions know what you do." I wanted to say, they know. They just pretend they don't. That night, I sat in the dark and thought about every scientist I knew who stayed silent. Not cowards, not traitors, just trapped. Trapped by clearance levels, mortgages, medals. The kind of traps they don't teach you about in school. And I thought about the other silence, the one that comes after a decision is made. Because once a thing happens, you don't get to raise your hand twice. We are on the edge now. This story is not just about war. It is about a man who was not listened to. But he should have been. If you want these true and forgotten stories to be heard louder, subscribe to the channel. This will help us continue telling them. And write in the comments, what would you have done in the scientist's place? Would you have kept quiet or gone against the system? You ever feel the world shift under your feet? But nobody else seems to notice. It was August now. Morning came quiet, like it had something to hide. Sun rose soft over the desert. Same train whistles, same worn boots on gravel, same coffee burnt black at the diner on 2nd and East. Everything looked the same, but I felt it in my gut. Something was about to give, and when it did, it wouldn't make a sound as at first. By then, I was used to being ignored. The man who used to work on the bomb. The brilliant mind who broke protocol. Depending on who you asked, I was either a traitor or a tragedy. But I'll tell you what stung the most. Not the loss of clearance, not the blackballing, not the quiet visits or the rearranged desk drawers. What stung was the silence from the people who knew I was right. Fellow scientists, men I worked beside, folks who used to quote Einstein in the morning and close the lab down with Miles Davis in the evening. They knew what we were building. They felt it in their bones. But when the train started moving too fast, they laid down on the tracks and called it patriotism. That morning, I was walking down Central Ave. Heat rising off the pavement like a warning. Stopped by a corner store. Bought a newspaper and an orange soda. I remember that because it was the last normal thing I did before everything broke loose. The headline wasn't what hit me. It was the lack of one. Just war updates. Europe stabilizing. Japan resisting. But nothing about it. Nothing about the device. No mention of what I knew was about to happen. See, they weren't announcing it yet. Because they hadn't dropped it. Yet. Around noon, I stopped by the post office. Mrs. Edwards, a woman with a gray bun and a voice like gravel, handed me a thin envelope. No return address. But I recognized the seal. War Department. Inside, Dr. Hendley. Your presence is no longer required in any official capacity. Further contact with military personnel is discouraged. No action is needed. No action is needed. You ever get fired twice for the same thing? I chuckled. Out loud. Folks turned their heads. I didn't care. Because by now they weren't just trying to forget me. They were trying to erase the fact that someone had ever raised their hand. I went home, poured a glass of water, sat by the fan and stared at the wall. And then it happened. A low whisper on the radio. A bulletin. An event of significant military consequence has occurred in the Pacific Theater. That's how they said it, like it was a shift in the weather. But I knew. The clock had struck, and somewhere far from this dusty little town, a city had just stopped existing. Now let me say this plain. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I froze. Not from shock. I saw it coming, but from the weight, because knowing something terrible is going to happen and watching it still happen, that's a kind of pain they don't train you for. I walked to the train station that evening, not to leave, just to move. People were milling about. Soldiers on leave, old men smoking in the shade, kids playing with marbles. The world was still spinning, and I remember thinking, if only they knew what just happened on the other side of it. But they didn't, and maybe that was the point. Later that night I tuned the radio again. This time, they were more open. The United States has dropped a new weapon on an enemy city. Military sources confirm unprecedented damage. Japanese forces are reportedly stunned. Unprecedented damage. They said it like they were reading out baseball scores. No mention of civilians. No word on children. Just a test passed. A mission accomplished. And that was the moment I felt the first real crack. Not in the government. Not in the system. In me. You spend your life believing you're part of something larger, that your work matters, that your brain, this gift you were given, is helping push the world forward. But what if it pushes too far? What if the same mind that calculates a cure ends up perfecting a wound? And what if the country you love loves you back only when you're useful? That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the floor and pulled out a copy of the report they tried to bury. Ran my fingers across the edges. Imagined the buildings, the streets, the people, all of it, now gone. Just like I said it would be. And I thought, so what now? I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But I knew this much. If they weren't going to talk about what just happened, then someone had to. Everything changes now. You've followed me this far. But what comes next? That's the chapter where silence ends and truth starts walking with both feet. Stay close. We're just getting started. You can only sit in the quiet for so long before it starts talking back. It had been 3 days since the announcement. 3 days since the world changed and no one in my neighborhood so much as blinked. I sat on my porch with the radio humming behind me. Glass of water in hand. No sugar, no ice, just heat, dust, and the echo of something awful. You ever hear something so big, so final, that your body doesn't even know how to hold it? That was me. And I'll tell you what made it worse. The celebration. They threw parades, not for peace, for the bomb. Flags, drums, headlines. Victory through science. New weapon ends the war faster. A technological triumph. And there I was, the man who warned them, sitting with nothing but an empty file box and a notebook full of truths nobody wanted. They called it progress. I called it what it was, a line crossed, a point of no return. But who the hell wants to hear that over a marching band? I walked into a cafe the next morning, same one I used to grade papers in. Regular folks, regular noise. But now the walls had a new poster. Thank you, scientists. You saved our boys. That hit like a brick. I wasn't sure if I wanted to laugh or throw something. A kid behind the counter, maybe 19, saw me looking at it. He grinned and said, "Bet you wish you'd stayed in, huh? You'd be a hero by now." I smiled, that tight, polite kind you give when someone steps on your foot and thanks you for standing still. But let me tell you, the world might have been clapping, but the ground was cracking, and not everyone was cheering. I started getting letters, handwritten, careful, unsigned. Was it true? Did they know? Is there more coming? My brother's stationed in Okinawa. Should we be worried? I didn't have answers for all of it, but I wrote back, because if you've got the truth and stay quiet, you might as well be lying. Then came the knock. Middle of the afternoon, dry heat, thick in the air. An older man stood at my door. Gray suit, briefcase, clean shoes, too clean for New Mexico dust. He didn't introduce himself. "Dr. Hendley, we're aware you've been distributing unapproved information." I leaned against the doorway. "And I'm aware you've been dropping unapproved fire from the sky. Looks like we're both in the loop." His face didn't change. "This isn't a threat. It's a warning. The narrative is set. Your continued involvement will only hurt your reputation." I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. My reputation was buried the minute I told the truth. "You're talking to a ghost." He nodded slowly, like he expected that. Then he pulled out a folder. Slim, unlabeled, slid it across my table. I didn't open it. I didn't have to. "You read it," he said. "You'll understand." Then he left. It took me 3 hours to open that thing. Not because I was scared, because I was tired. Tired of the games, the whispers, the damage done in the dark with clean hands. Inside, photos. Not of the device. Of what was left behind. Shadows burned into stone. Civilians with no warning. A city that looked like the earth itself had flinched. They gave me the images not to warn me, but to shut me up. See, if they show you horror and say, "We already did it," you're supposed to realize resistance is too late. But they misjudged the kind of man I was. I didn't hide the folder. I didn't lock it away. I took it to the Veterans Hall, showed it to a group of men who'd fought with their hands, not paperwork. One of them, a former sergeant, looked at a photo for a long time. Then he said, "This ain't war, this is punishment." And just like that, I wasn't alone anymore. Over the next week, I spoke in 6 churches. 2 union halls and 1 backyard barbecue. I didn't rant. I didn't accuse. I told. I laid it out plain. What we knew, what we built, what it cost. And here's the part that surprised me. People listened. Not everyone. Not loudly. But enough to matter. A nurse stood up in one meeting and said, "If they used it once, they'll use it again. We need to be ready." Ready, not for attack, for accountability. Of course, it didn't take long for the pressure to return. Phone calls with no voice on the other end. Articles calling me disgruntled. Flyers calling me ungrateful. Funny how fast the word ungrateful gets thrown at a black man with too many facts. But I didn't fold, because this wasn't about me anymore. This was about what happens when a country gets so caught up in winning. It forgets what it looks like to lose something human. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I kept hearing that question. If not you, then who? That's what it came down to. Not fame, not fear, just duty. The kind that doesn't come with a paycheck or a medal. The kind you carry when no one else will. You've heard the fallout. But what comes after the smoke? In the next chapter, everything they tried to bury comes face to face with the people it was meant to protect. And this time, the silence won't be enough. By the time the dust settled, the official story had been written in ink. They called it necessary. They called it strategic. They called it mercy, said it ended the war and saved lives. I'd heard those words before, spoken by polished men in polished suits, sitting behind polished desks. But the ones who actually felt the bomb, they weren't writing editorials. They were still trying to find their children, or what was left of them. So I stopped arguing with headlines, and I started showing people what those headlines refused to say. I took the folder, the one they gave me, not to inform but to intimidate, and I made copies. Not sensational, not graphic, just the facts. A city that once had 340,000 people, now reduced to a crater and silence. Photos, data, first-hand testimonies I managed to find through letters passed hand to hand. I called it The Cost. Simple, honest, sharp, and I passed it out, quietly, carefully, like it was fire in a town full of dry wood. You'd be surprised how fast things spread when they're real. A young pastor in Denver read it aloud to his congregation. A school teacher in Chicago used it in her civics class, though she had to pretend it was fiction. A railroad worker in Atlanta copied the whole thing by hand and sent it to a veterans paper. And slowly, not loudly, but firmly, people began to ask. Ask about consequences. Ask about who gets to decide what peace looks like. Ask why someone like me, who tried to warn them, was pushed aside like an inconvenience. And that was the crack in the wall. I got invited to speak in Philadelphia, then Cleveland, then St. Louis, not by newspapers or universities, by unions, churches, factory committees, veterans' kitchens. They didn't ask for speeches, they asked for truth. And I gave it to them, not angry, not bitter, just honest. We can't change what happened, I told them, but we can decide what kind of country tells the truth about it. That line stayed with folks. I'd hear it repeated in places I'd never been, scribbled on diner napkins, echoed at train stations. You can't kill an idea once it's walked through enough rooms. Now, don't get me wrong. The system didn't go quiet. They sent men in suits to ask questions. They called me a destabilizer in some press circles. There was even a government memo passed around titled Managing the Hendley Narrative. Imagine that. I was no longer a man. I was a narrative, a problem to manage. But they were too late, because by now I wasn't the only one telling the story. I'd lit the match, and others were carrying the flame. I'll never forget the town hall in Baltimore. Packed house, folding chairs, fans spinning overhead. I was halfway through my talk when a young woman stood up. Maybe 22, wore her hair in tight braids. She asked, "If you had stayed quiet, maybe you'd still have your job, still be comfortable. Why speak out when it cost you everything?" I didn't answer right away. I let the room settle. Then I said, "Because comfort ain't peace. And silence, that's how people disappear." She nodded. Then she sat. But the way she looked at me, like she saw a future in what I said, that stayed with me. The turning point came when a small local paper, just 4 pages, run out of a garage, published a piece called "The Man Who Said No." They didn't ask me. They just did it. Used my own words from a speech in Tennessee. That issue went statewide. Then it crossed borders. Then it landed on the desk of a congressman. And for the first time, someone in Washington said my name out loud in a meeting that mattered. No, I wasn't reinstated. No medals, no public apologies. But I got something better. A letter from a soldier's mother. She wrote, "They said my son died a hero, but you reminded me he was also a person. Thank you for making sure the country doesn't forget that." That letter sits in my top drawer to this day, not because it makes me proud, but because it reminds me why I spoke up in the first place. You see, they thought the weapon was the explosion, but they were wrong. The real weapon was the lie they tried to wrap it in, and once that lie cracked, they had nothing left but noise. I still teach. Not in a lab, not at a university, in basements, in borrowed rooms, in backyard circles where folks gather to hear the whole story. We don't talk about politics, we talk about power. Not bombs, but choices. And what kind of people we become when we stop being afraid of telling the truth. You've walked with me through the fire, but we're not done yet. In the final chapter, we face what they tried hardest to avoid: accountability, and the quiet reckoning that comes when the story refuses to go away. I used to think truth worked like math. 2 + 2 is 4, always was, always will be. But the older I got, the more I learned. Truth don't walk into the room dressed for dinner. It shows up muddy, bleeding, maybe limping, and some folks pretend they don't see it just so they can keep eating in peace. Well, guess what? By the end of this story, the truth didn't knock. It kicked the door in. It started small. A new university opened a peace studies program and quietly reached out. They didn't say my name in the press, didn't ask for a resume, just invited me to speak off record to their students. I went. Room smelled like fresh chalk and tired dreams. Young faces. Not naive, just tired of being lied to. One kid stood up after my talk and asked, "Do you think it'll happen again?" I looked him in the eye. That depends on how many people in this room forget what it looked like the first time. That line landed harder than I expected, because by now the second wave had begun. See, for a while they treated the bomb like a one-time event. A moment, a decision. But war has a memory, and so does the machine that made it. I started hearing whispers from former colleagues, names I hadn't heard in years. They weren't apologizing. Not yet. But they were uneasy, because the bomb had worked too well, and now every government with a flag wanted one. What we unleashed, it wasn't peace, it was a blueprint. That's when the press came back, not the big networks, not the polished anchors, the local voices, college radio, community papers. They asked, "What do we do now that we know?" That was the shift. They weren't questioning if it happened. They were questioning how to live with it. And for the first time, the people writing the stories weren't trying to protect reputations. They were trying to protect futures. I did interviews again. Cautiously. I still spoke carefully. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted my words to last. I wasn't shouting into microphones. I was planting seeds. Then came the hearing. A congressional subcommittee. Small, symbolic, but very real. They wanted a testimony. Somebody in the back office must have slipped my name onto the list. Because 2 weeks later, I was sitting in front of a panel of stone-faced men and one woman who looked like she'd read every single word I'd ever written. "Dr. Hendley," she said, "is it true you predicted the long-term civilian toll before the weapon was used?" "Yes, ma'am. Down to the year." "Why weren't you listened to?" I smiled, just a little. Because listening to me would have meant stopping, and stopping wasn't part of the plan. The room went quiet. No notes, no whispering, just the sound of truth, raw, heavy, undeniable. They didn't air the hearing, but someone leaked the transcript. And suddenly, my words were being quoted by high school teachers, protest banners, podcast hosts. I didn't ask for that. But I didn't fight it either, because once you've been ignored long enough, being heard is almost too strange to believe. Then something happened I never expected. A letter from the office of General Leslie Groves, Jr., the Sun. He wrote, "I read your original report. I found it in the archives while working on a retrospective. I just wanted to say, I wish my father had listened. I sat with that letter for a long time. Didn't write back. Didn't need to. Because that letter wasn't just for me. It was for the people who knew and stayed silent. It was for every scientist who signed away their doubt. Every officer who knew the blast radius, but not the name of a single child in its path. One afternoon, I stood outside a museum. They were unveiling a new exhibit. Not about the war, but about the cost. They invited me to cut the ribbon. I almost didn't go, but when I did, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. A small plaque tucked in the corner, simple engraving. Dr. Robert Hendley, warned of disaster, was ignored, spoke anyway. No statues, no flags, just that line. And that was enough, because the world had finally said what it should have said 30 years ago. We heard you. Today, I still walk, still speak, still teach, not to change the past, but to stop it from getting comfortable. Because history doesn't repeat itself by accident. It repeats itself by invitation. So what do we do now? We tell the story, fully, clearly, without dressing it up. We speak for the ones who never got to. We name the silence when we see it. We walk toward hard truths, not around them. And if you've come this far with me, then maybe, just maybe, you'll carry this story too. Because the bomb wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of what we choose to remember, and what we dare to question next. This story may be over, but the mirror it holds up, that stays. If it made you feel something, share it, speak it, keep it alive. Because the truth, it walks further when we walk it together.